Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Reverend Kosho Finch.
All right. So we are on episode 10 of True Words, a Shingon Buddhist podcast. And this episode is really a milestone for us. It's our first double-digit episode. So we've been doing this for 10 weeks now.
Yeah, I can't believe it's already 10 weeks. So we have to send out a thank you to everyone who's been listening and giving feedback on the Facebook page as to topics they might want to see in the future. And I think after looking through some of those suggestions, this is one of the topics people are interested in, the Buddhist perspective on science and perhaps even climate change.
All right. So how should we get started this evening?
Well, the one question I get often is people, if they don't have a background in Buddhism, will ask, what is the Buddhist view of science in general? And I think it comes from the expectation that most traditional religions might be in opposition to science or feel threatened by scientific discovery in some way. And I think generally my experience has been that when I tell them that we probably don't have the same viewpoint, they're a bit surprised. So maybe we can start off by why that might be. What makes us different than some other of the world's great religions, that we have a slightly different perspective there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, sure. So starting off, I would be very interested too to hear your perspective on what you think makes Buddhism different in this sense.
Well, I think, one, we don't have the same type of creation story where the teaching is flowing from the same entity that perhaps creates the universe. So that establishes the individual in the system in a different perspective than maybe a lot of other religions do. So, for example, the Abrahamic religions, Judeo-Christian traditions would have humanity coming from as a creation of God as well as the earth and the universe. Whereas I think Buddhism views these things as systems that are more interdependent rather than humanity being sort of in charge of the earth or a creation of some sort or having some sort of special place or mission within our world. So that's probably the first major difference that gives us a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, and I would understand that in terms of, in the Buddhist term, causes and conditions, right? Everything comes out of these causes and conditions, and then everything ceases to exist because of causes and conditions. And ultimately, I think all of this goes back to the idea of causes, conditions, and effect as well. So all of them are built into each other. When one act, if done in the right circumstances, leads to a certain effect, which really I feel is what science talks about as well.
I would agree. I think you can make, not to say that Buddhism is a science, but I think there are a lot of comparisons that can be drawn between the scientific method and the method the Buddha recommended to people for examining ideas, questioning ideas, and for even how to build faith, to basically test it out before taking on faith. But I would agree the idea of causes and conditions sets up a totally different model of looking at the world that we live in and our place in it. And hopefully one that gives us a little bit more pause before we do things and asks us to look a little bit deeper before we take action, rather than thinking that the earth or the universe or our environment is somehow separate from ourselves. I think a big piece in that is perhaps the Buddhist view of the self. So one of the problems that people have is the view that they are in control of something, in control of the universe, or in control of a particular personality, and so they end up engaging a lot of seeking behaviors. So I think a lot of the concerns that modern people have and modern science points out regarding climate change has come about through this type of seeking behavior, where people have sought greater wealth, to extract greater amounts of natural resources to somehow set themselves apart from other people, perhaps rather than seeing how they live actually independent on other people, both in their own country and around the world. So I think a little bit more of that type of view perhaps would change the way we approach things like energy use and the effect that it's going to have on our lives, rather than seeing it as something to do just to gain wealth or gain advantage over others.
Okay, definitely. So I can see this in terms of whenever we use any sort of resource, it changes the environment in terms of that resource is being decreased. So there's a difference in where, for example, that energy is going, whether that's electricity or water or fuel. So there's a change there that's already affecting other people, because of course the number of resources, the amount of resources we have on this planet is limited. And so if we're using some, then that means other people are going to have to use less.
Yeah, and I think that's probably not the way we think when we fill our gas tank or turn on the light switch. We don't necessarily consider that our use is reducing other people's potential use or impacting someone in some other part of the world. But I do think that Buddhist teaching has kind of in a very subtle way a lot to say about this. So in the Buddha Sutras, the Bodhisattva ideal, the Bodhisattva gives thought to even the smallest forms of life, or will often give thoughts to forms of life that in our kind of day-to-day thinking we would think would be a lower level life form. So I one idea that comes to mind is in the Jataka Mala, the Jataka stories, the past life stories of the Buddha, where there are times where the Buddha in various incarnations sacrifices his life or gives up his life for others, and sometimes not even other people, but for animals or life forms that are below him. So I think if sort of implicit in the teaching is the idea that no matter what level we're at, if we're a rabbit in a field or a human or kind of no matter what level we are, that there is some connection that we all share. And a little bit more of that view or that consideration in the way we live our lives with regard to energy use and what type of energy we use, I think definitely could help in our greater conversation regarding concerns about climate change.
Definitely. And I think for this, something that I just thought about was the experience that I think a lot of people will have when they enter a buffet. So upon entering, and I was guilty of this as a child as well, I would go for all of my favorite foods and eat as much of those favorite foods as I wanted. Because of course it's a buffet, it's limitless food really. And of course if I'm paying whatever amount, I should eat my dollar's worth, right? Mm-hmm. So with that, I realized later on that one, that's just a horribly unhealthy way of going about at a buffet, but then also, was it really worth it? All of that was done out of a sense of desire, a sense of greed, a sense of I want more. And it became that I was eating to the point where the food no longer tasted good. I was just eating for the sake of eating and taking in. Mm-hmm. And I think that on a broader level, this is essentially what happens with a lot of resources that we use, whether knowingly or unknowingly.
I would agree. There's a concept in I guess technically it comes from Buddhism, but it's baked in now to Japanese culture of mottainai, not to waste things, and it's very much a part of temple culture. Things are recycled and reused over and over and over. But it really comes from the idea of thinking about where did the resource come from. So someone gave it to the temple or gifted it to the temple, and trying to make the absolute most of the donor's donation. So, something that is clothing one day is maybe a wash rag, years later, and then maybe is turned into padding for a pillow, and it's used on and on and on, more than perhaps its initial intended use. But trying to find multiple ways to use things is probably not the way I thought of things when I was younger. Something wears out, you think, oh, I get rid of it, I get a new one, or I get a new one just because somebody else had a new one and said I should get it, or because I think I need to compete with others, or it'll make me look better, or people will think of me in a better way if I have a new one, something along these lines. So we engage in a lot of that thinking, and I think it carries over into how we view natural resources and the world around us. There's a lot of, obviously in our society, there's a lot of consumerism, and maybe only recently I've seen more and more ingenious ways of packaging to reduce waste than I saw before. So I think more thought on not only what we need to use, but how to reuse, and then the effect of taking and actually depriving others from having the same use of things would be, is I think kind of built into Buddhist practice, but something that sometimes we have to point out and remind ourselves.
I think this really is what I experienced when I was going through a retreat at the monastery. Really nothing was wasted. I mean, we had to finish everything that was on our plate for meals, and at one point after the meal we would have to rinse our bowls with hot water, and depending on who was leading the meal that day, we would either be instructed to drink it, or they would say, oh, it's okay, just use that to water the plants later, which I always thought was disgusting, but actually is okay. I mean, people have done it for centuries. It's just another lesson. But I think really the idea of conservation in Buddhism and of reusing and recycling these things, I think it's more or less connected to the idea of being able to see the potential within objects and within other beings even.
I would agree. I think especially in beings, I would say probably the practice of seeing potential in objects is a greater practice of seeing a larger potential in sentient beings. And I guess I would kind of highlight Buddhism's use of this term of sentient being rather than humanity or a particular level or type of life form. It's a very democratic concept or egalitarian concept for a spiritual system, that humanity is never placed above any other life form in the sutras and the conversation in Buddhist teaching. So consideration is given at all levels for that potential. And I think oftentimes when we use a resource, no matter what it is, sometimes we don't see the potential for things. We don't see what else it could be used for, how it could be used, or how someone else may be able to use it. Some things that may no longer be of use to us may go on and have life for many more lifetimes in someone else's use. So I think partially it's a practice to open our minds up to new potential, and that can be done in the kitchen. It can be done at the dining table. It can be done at the store when we think about what we're buying, how it's packaged, the quantities that we consume, trying not to buy more than we actually need, which is sometimes hard in America when it seems like if you buy more, it's cheaper, even though you can't consume it. So I think a lot of times it's seeing that in many ways we're depriving others by taking more than we can actually need, or more than we can actually use.
Definitely. And I think in regards to this, I was able to see this firsthand at the temple when I realized that all of the packaging for things like candles, all of these cardboard boxes, were reused. So they would be used in packaging other things that the temple would give out to visitors. The ribbons that would be attached to the candles, they would take that out and then save it for the end of the year to tie little gifts with, to give out to visitors as well. And so everything was constantly being reused. And it almost seemed like we never had to really buy any of these things, where, of course, these are purchasable at the local store or craft store, but because we were able to reuse, we saved a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of energy to go out and get these things. But also we're really saving the environment too. We're not creating more trash in the world as well.
I would agree. I had the same experience. One of the temples in Hawaii, it goes through so many incense, especially around New Year's time, constantly refilling the wooden containers with incense sticks, but the paper inside the boxes with the incense, one side has kind of the history of the incense company, and there's a longer sheet of paper in there wrapped around. It was all saved and used later as scrap paper for taking phone messages and all kinds of things. And initially I was thinking, just hurry up and refill this container and throw this paper away. And then I saw people going and getting it out, and I realized, everything was used to the fullest extent. So it was very eye-opening to think that the donations of money that went to purchase the incense, every part of that could be used was used and put to use for the temple. So I think that's helpful. We learn a lot from doing those things in small ways, and I think that becomes a practice that transfers to our larger practice of conservation, but also of recognizing just the value in things inherently.
So I think in terms of this, how should we transition from this to the topic of climate change?
Well, I think so. We're both have a connection with the Pacific Northwest, and we've had some interesting weather this last few years that's unusual. But I think if you look historically, this is an area that there's been a lot of very visible use of natural resource. Most visibly, of course, is trees. So it's still very evident to see logging going on here, and there's quite a bit of a tension between those who want to log more and those who want to conserve trees, and what should be done, that kind of thing. So I think unlike a lot of resources that are under the ground, or where there may be a mine, or the extraction process isn't so visible, when it comes to the most prevalent natural resource in this area, trees, it's very obvious when they're cut, how the land looks very different. It's not something that's easily hidden. And I think we can see, if you just look at this one, natural resource that we have, it's there's a limit. It's sometimes we think these forests are endless, but just driving around between Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, you can see large swaths of area where it's been clear cut, and you realize that this is a finite resource, probably in the same way that, of course, oil is a finite resource and most anything, and there's going to be a limit, but the needs and desires of humanity appear to be nearly limitless, and population continues to grow every day. So it doesn't take a lot of thinking to realize that we're going to run out of these resources. So we need to look for some type of renewable resource, just like I think is sort of secretly being taught to us all the time in the temple environment, when we're taught to reuse and to maximize the use of everything. So I think that's probably the first step. It's just recognizing that these things that contribute to climate change are things that we're going to run out of, that aren't going to be around forever.
Mm-hmm. And I think we can tie this back into the beginning of today's podcast, when we were talking about the influences that we as individuals have on our environment through things like causes and conditions. With one thing that we do, if done in the right condition, for example, if we are using a certain resource in the condition that resources are finite, we get a certain effect, which I think you very explicitly pointed out, that we're going to run out at some point. Mm-hmm. And so within this, it's sort of the idea that these are things that some of this is due to our intervention into the system. The other part, the conditions, I feel, is more the environmental aspect, the circumstantial aspect. So if we do a certain act in a certain condition, it produces a certain effect. So it's either we change the circumstance, which is usually not very possible, but the other part would be changing what we do and how we affect the world and our environment.
I would agree. I think most things, when we realize there's a finite number, if there's scarcity, the value goes up. And I think what Buddhism is trying to teach us is what we mentioned earlier, is this sort of inherent value in everything. But we don't often see that things have this value. We just see oftentimes, how could it benefit us, or what is its value to me personally? It's a very selfish or self-centered viewpoint. And a lot of Buddhist practice is about expanding or changing that viewpoint, putting ourselves in a different position. And a huge part of Buddhist teaching is that concept of interdependence. So on the one hand, we may use a resource, but we don't think of the effect that resource has. So every tree that's cut, every ounce of fossil fuel that's burned doesn't just go away. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a consequence to the use of all of these things. But as a society, we haven't spent a lot of time focused on that side. We all enjoy, the cars, the buses, the airplanes going, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the exhausts, subsidence in soils when things are extracted, all the various consequences that come along with those things, and how that affects us and how it affects others. So I think in modern times we talk a lot about climate change, but we might want to talk a little bit more about all of the other effects that happen. Climate change is probably just one of them, but oftentimes I think for most of us the difficulty is it seems really big and it's not as obvious day to day, and probably just like we've been talking about some of the examples in the monastery, Buddhist practice is usually very good at bringing things closer, bringing it home, bringing it down to what we're doing at that very moment. So if we can do a little bit more practice about thinking how these things happen on a day-to-day basis, how we can change our behaviors little by little, then we probably have a greater perspective on the interdependence concept. Because it can be, when concepts are really large, it is difficult to wrap our minds around it. For example, Buddhist practice doesn't start off by saying necessarily, contemplate all the world's suffering. It may ask, you individually, when have you not had a good day? When have you experienced things that were distasteful? When have you had a difficult time? And then extrapolate out, to other people you knew who had difficulties, and then slowly, little by little, expand those things out. But I think all of these changes in the larger environment we've all experienced in some way. We just don't see it as connected to our actions as a society on a whole, as we do sometimes when things come and affect us independently, or we're the only ones that feel like we've felt that experience or had that problem. Those are the things that become more personal to us and become more of an issue. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why the world as a whole has a difficulty addressing it. If it's crime and you've been a victim of crime, then you want justice. But if it's climate change, even though everyone is subject to the effects, we don't feel it as personally all the time. And I think that's probably why people have a hard time focusing on it. But as we mentioned in the beginning, a lot of Buddhist practice is trying to recall our connection to all things. But I think the way we have to start that off is in very small ways, and then expand out. I think probably our biggest difficulty here is just that it's a really big target, and it's hard for us to focus on or hold in our hands.
Definitely, and I think wrapping that up and sort of going back to the beginning when we talked about these little practices that we can do, making sure that we only get what we can finish if we're at a restaurant or a buffet, or if we're cooking for ourselves. Because being on a college campus, I noticed that food waste is abundant, especially in a dining hall where it's buffet style. Anything that looks good becomes very enticing, and it might be very tempting to get a whole plate full of that, but is that really what we should be eating, or are we really going to eat all of that? And I think really framing it in terms of only using what we need is a good way of going about at conserving. And I think, of course, a lot of monastics don't do this practice anymore, but I think even now in the Theravada school, they still abide by one meal a day before noon. There are many explanations to it, but I think on a very practical level, you can serve 2 out of 3 meals in a day.
That's very true. For the I think majority of Buddhist history, monastics have often not had access to a reliable food source. So it was very logical to conserve, but I think it was also, a meditation in action to think about how, in ancient times when you would go on alms rounds, not being too much of a burden on the world, on others, on the land directly. If you had to go on alms rounds multiple times, it would potentially become a burden on the people. But now we don't think about the use of food or the intake of food in that manner. We see it available and we buy as much as we want, or if there's a buffet, we take as much as we want. But we don't think about necessarily the repercussions of that. Then puts pressure on the need to refill that food or replenish. There's a cascade of actions that are set into motion in the sort of the stream of commerce to bring more food to that place, or someone who's ordering may assume there's a higher demand than there actually is. So that's not in our consciousness when we go for the 4th scoop of ice cream necessarily.
Oh yes. And I remember in the past I've had experiences with family members actually who told me that actually, since we're going to a buffet, we should eat as much as we want and really push ourselves to the extreme, because these are services that we've paid for. But I think there has to be a distinction between paying for something and being able to do something because you've paid, and whether or not we should do that for the interest of not just our own health and safety, but also the future of our entire world.
I would agree. I don't want the takeaway of our talk today to be Buddhists can't go to buffets, but
A lot of temples are buffet style, actually.
Yeah, very true. Personally, I never feel is a good deal for me. I never eat enough to. I think it'd be much better to spend less money and get a small meal because I can never eat enough at a buffet to justify the cost. So, I do think though you're right. A lot of times it's our perception that we should act in a certain way or should consume in a certain way that guides our behavior rather than our true needs. When I lived in China, I think it was quite common. You may have heard this, but during the Cultural Revolution and during those times, people didn't have much food at all if they had a meal every day. So it was very common later for children to be scolded to never even leave a grain of rice, to really think about the suffering, the work of the farmers to harvest and bring that rice to their bowl. So no matter what, never would a single grain of rice go to waste. And I think that's common. I'm sure every culture has, the mother says something to the child to remind them not to be wasteful with food. But oftentimes when we get older, we forget those lessons. And for most people's living memory, things have not been so difficult. So we oftentimes lose sight of the times when there are difficulties. So again, I think Buddhist practice is asking us primarily, no matter what that is, be it climate change, any major changes that we're seeing in the world or needs, it's to expand our viewpoint, to broaden our viewpoint and consider the experiences of others and how our actions are part of systems that cause people difficulties and cause people to suffer, basically. And I think that's not something that we think about on a day-to-day basis.
Gotcha. All right. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up with tonight's session?
No, I just want to thank everybody who's been listening and all the feedback, and we'll continue to take your suggestions for topics and move the podcast forward.
All right. Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you.